Why do we need to know demographic information in the first place? Just because we did something one way one time does not mean we are stuck to that. We are evolving as people and culture and feedback evolves.
I think that my identity and my intersecting identities shapes how I do my work. It shapes how I value data and the voices and the people behind that data. And intersectionality is really talking about us having overlapping identities.
So this is our hosting panel.
My name is Amani Austin.
My name is Amani Austin.
My name is Tim Larson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amani Austin. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a Black woman who does evaluation work. A couple of things to know about me is I think that my identity and my intersecting identities shape how I do my work. It shapes how I value data and the voices and the people behind that data. And so I'm excited to get to talk about demographic data really from an equity-centered and a people-centered perspective, because that's my lens and that's part of my value system. So yeah, nice to meet you all. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, my name is Amari Vogel and I go by she, her pronouns. I studied psychology and social work in college. When I came out of college and we were experiencing distrust in formal institutions and particularly science, medicine, and academia, I saw research as an opportunity to understand how we can get a grip on what people really believe is reality. And part of doing that is asking good questions and asking the right questions and getting information from folks that are not always heard from.
We understand that diversity is important to getting a complete and holistic perspective on a specific community. If we have 3 individuals who come from the same MBA program, coming from the same preferential background, they will come to a decision that is potentially skewed on their experiences and not lead to the most strategic, holistic, sustainable solution.
Intersectionality is really talking about us having overlapping identities. An example for me is I self-identify as Black, but I'm also a woman, right? I'm also a first-generation college student, right? And there are layers to which how multiple parts of my identity shape who I am. And so as we go through these demographics, and we're going to kind of look at them individually in terms of the question, always understanding that you're showing up with multiple identities all at the same time. And so just want to make sure that we're holding that to be true as we have this conversation. And Amri, I know you wanted to kind of share something as well.
Yeah, so how people identify in their social relationships or when they're asked questions on the census can be different and complicated. So, for example, my grandfather was half Mexican, but I didn't grow up in a family that had a strong tie to Mexican culture. We didn't really celebrate any cultural traditions related to our heritage, and his family was very heavily assimilated. So I don't really identify with that part of my personal identity. And also, I look white, I path as white. And so I feel like my cultural experience has not reflected that part of my heritage. That being said, there could be an argument made that on the census data, I should be putting that I am Hispanic. So it's complicated for people, and reflecting that in how we conduct research is really important, and recognizing that people may be struggling with how those intersections play out and which one they are supposed to prioritize if you only let them choose one can be really difficult for folks.
Think about data as storytelling, right? I think that's language that we're using more in the field, right? Is it tells a story. And so your demographics are your who is in this story, who's included, who's being reflected, who's not being reflected. And so being able to identify and capture and group who is in this story is important. One of the things that we get to move further in is that when we're able to disaggregate data to look at how are those that self-identify as women experiencing certain things. A great example is when we look at pay rates, right? And we disaggregate things by different groups. And so what it does is it helps us identify issues. It helps us understand needs for particular groups, and it helps us make informed decisions so that we can support things and make things more equitable. And so that really should be our primary focus. One thing I do want to consider is that for some people, they struggle with, why are you asking me these questions? Why do I have to make visible who I am? And what we're looking at is, rather than an individual level, we're trying to look at a systems level. What groups and what communities of people are being impacted and in what way? So demographic data gives you an opportunity to kind of zoom in and look at those elements. And then the last piece that I would add is that's on the kind of system lens, right? That's on the internal view, the person that's asking the questions and looking at the data. On the side for people who are responding, they need to be able to see themselves reflected in the questions. Does it make sense? Can they answer the questions, right? And so we have this tension. We're trying to make sure that we can group so we can make decisions, but also making sure that people see themselves reflected.
I think everyone matters. I think we can analyze the data, but we can't analyze what we don't have, which takes us to types of survey bias. In the types of survey bias, and I'll use St. John's neighborhood as an example, we did our best to collect as many responses as possible. We got over 800 community responses in a community of about 12,000 residents, which is pretty impressive, especially considering that the survey was 10 essay questions. That's a lot of essay questions for a test that you are paying tuition for and getting graded on. The fact that people did this for free with minimal incentive, there's some implicit incentives that we could touch on if you ask me in the Q&A section. There's likely a bias within the data, and there are a few kinds of bias that we should be aware of when it comes to the neighborhood study for St. John's that we improved upon for Arbor Lodge. And there are other communities interested in doing the survey that we have. Just because we did something one way one time does not mean we are stuck to that. We are evolving as people and culture and feedback evolves. So types of bias that we want to be cognizant of include convenience sampling. So if I go out and I'm surveying people walking downtown, that is going to collect just the people who are downtown, the folks who are homebound, the folks who leave, the folks who shop online. I may not get their feedback, and I will lose the understanding of why they don't go downtown. Similarly, voluntary response, the people who are opting to talk to a stranger in a public setting, skew towards the people who feel safe talking to strangers in public settings. There are many demographics that feel more shy around other demographics. How do we opt into collecting more feedback and broader feedback? This can result in undercoverage, so the folks who aren't going into those spaces will not be as represented. Gender, income, race, those are the most obvious ones for community studies, and that will vary depending on your use case. So if you are working in HR or with voice of the employee surveys, collecting departments, managers, locations, very important. If you're working with consumer data, are you collecting from a variety of regions? What do we mean by prompt design matters?
When we say prompt design matters, we're talking about both the questions and how you ask the question, as well as the options that you give people to respond. Are you forcing them to identify as only one particular group? In some cases, that's extremely relevant for gender, race, or ethnicity. Or are you asking in a way that doesn't align with how people identify? Those things will influence how people respond, the data that you gather, the information that you get from these folks, and whether it really reflects the people that you're talking to and learning from in your survey.
Language matters, right? Some of us have connections and we experience disconnection with certain type of language, right? We're asking people to identify themselves in a world where how we identify, how we see ourselves, how the world sees us is constantly changing and loaded. And so when we talk about the prompt design, it isn't just about the accuracy of getting it right. It's how will people experience this, right? Where do we need to define terms, right? So that we aren't making assumptions, right? Where do we make things make sense for people? And so I just always remind, remember, people have to answer these questions, right? And so how do we conduct our questions, conduct our answers, options in a way that really honors the human-centered perspective of things?
There's a great New York Times article about how the census has evolved since the census started. It changes about every iteration because we have a better understanding of the nuance and the complexities of identity. And that is going to continue to evolve as people explore orientation or relationship structures or non-traditional families. There are a lot of ways that people can start to identify, and that's going to increase as people move around geographically. The way I understood my identity and relationships in the Bay Area changed when I lived in Indiana, changed when I moved to Portland. It's always evolving, and it's really tough as researchers to be able to provide all of those options to folks.
This is a frame, right? This question, in my evaluation work, when I work with organizations, I like to offer them simple questions to help us look at our data. When you look at your demographic questions and the way you've designed them, do I see myself in these options? And a better question is, do others people see themselves in these options, right? Because we're looking at who's being included and who is being excluded, right? Who's not at the table, right? If we find that most of the participants, right, are white men, right, those voices, those perspectives are going to show up. Which voices are not in the room, right? And how do we get to engage those? And so being able to ask these simple questions, I think if you don't remember anything else here, is asking that question is, do I see myself in these options? Do other people see themselves in these options? And then from a kind of systemic lens, can we identify patterns, right, and make sense of these groups, right? It's kind of what we're doing.
So what's so hard? We just give them the options and they check it, right? Personally, I was intimidated by it. That's why it wasn't included in the St. John's data, but it will be included in our future neighborhood studies. Do you guys have challenges with demographic information? Is it just me?
No, it's not just you. These are social constructs, guys, right? Race and ethnicity, gender identity, these things are constantly changing. We're finding new language, we're finding language that we don't use anymore. And that will continue to happen, right? And so, again, this is part of why, closer to the end, we'll talk about principles, right? Is we can talk about maybe what's the best way to ask this question in 2024, right? And 2030. We might be shifting what this looks like, right? And so I think it's important to keep the pulse. And I think people don't like being put in boxes, right? So that's the difficulty, right? Is that we're asking questions to group and categorize information, right? So that we can make decisions, so that we can better understand folks. But people don't see themselves as boxes. And so we have to be flexible and be open and pretty inclusive in how we design these questions. And so there's always going to be this tension of, as a data person, I need to be able to identify trends. I need to be able to notice patterns. I need to be able to see who's doing well in this space and maybe who isn't. And also the person that's answering the question needs to not feel overwhelmed by the question and be able to answer the question.
For folks who were asking this question 10, 20 years ago, this was a fairly straightforward question. If I ask this question, what are the consequences? What are my risks here?
This is one that drives me pretty crazy.
Luminos is a text analytics platform. We have a de-biased engine that's gone through taking the cultural biases out of the language associations, allowing teams and companies to surface the insights of their unique organizations and study fields. If you are interested in doing a neighborhood study in your local area, please reach out to me. We are eager to help. The guideline that we're doing is, if the data is going to be public, we're happy to kind of leverage that and learn from it. And then for private enterprise stuff, we can have a separate discussion. But if you're doing a neighborhood study, please reach out. Let's talk.